covered now with lands increasing, take its tone in hand. Memory bits and pieces, traces of.
Welcome to the West End Video Newsletter. My name is Joe LaPiccolo, your host for this week's newsletter. Old-time politics, that's our theme for this week's show. We're going to go back in the history of the West End 30, 40 years ago and speak about the politics of the West End in those days and compare it to today's politics. Our guest today is Mr. Joseph Russo, whose family was very prominent and very active in West End politics many years ago. And he's here representing his dad to go over what politics was in those days. Welcome to the show, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. Nice to be here.
Yep, your second time on the show, and you're going to be very interesting today. Joe, can you tell us, give us a background on your West End days and how many years you lived there and so forth?
To talk about politics in the West End, he said, I was probably the last generation of of those who came out of the West End. I was the last class to graduate from St. Joseph's at that time. So basically what I can give you will be a little bit or a lot of what I remember from what my dad has told me and my own personal background. I happened to study history and government, and both were very prominent in the West End.
And a lot of your focus must have been on the West End, like you say. And your dad was a state representative? Or?
No, he was city councillor,
Okay.
Joe. He was city councillor from 1936 to 1950, and then he became election commissioner from the city of Boston from 1950 to 1964.
Mm-hmm. And you owned a business in the West End also?
We had a funeral home on 42A Green Street, originally starting on South Margin Street.
Mm-hmm.
Which Dad operated for 39 years until 1964 when we had to leave.
And today you're still in business? And
Today we're still in business at 814 American Legion Highway in Roslindale.
fine. And just tell me something. So even though the West End has gone, 30 years and you've been out of there many, many years, do you still get West Enders for your funerals, or many do you get?
Oh, surely. Yeah, there are a lot of people who were from the West End who haven't forgotten us and haven't forgotten my dad and our family, and we've maintained some very close ties,
Mm-hmm.
but not only business-wise, but on a personal basis. The one thing you hate to do, and that is to lose the friendships that were nourished from the West End.
That's one thing that I find no matter who I talk to or where I go, and people remember the West End is how, even though it's gone 30 years ago, over 30 years ago, the friendships are still, I've never seen such a bond or such enthusiasm when you talk about the West End to old friends.
Well, today even I had a visit from a fellow, Jim Peluso, who I knew when we were both 3 years old, starting in the West End, going to the Winchell School for kindergarten, pre-kindergarten in those days.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, we do keep in touch. It's been great.
That's wonderful. So and we're going to be having a reunion soon coming up in October, and I hope you and Jimmy will be attending.
Well, we did. Both of us came 2 years ago. Last year we had a family engagement that made us unable to go, but we're looking forward to it again.
Great. Old-time politics. You brought a book today that goes back 40 and 50 years.
Starts about 55, 56 years ago,
Okay.
1935, 1936.
And this one person that's always mentioned prominently about West End politics and who sort of ran the show at Ward 3. First of all, tell us what ward encompassed the West End, or what boundaries?
Well, Ward 3 at that time was the West End, the North End, and South End.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, although it's been cut up since then, they said that was the old Ward 3. And Ward 3 was the last of what I think you're leading into was Martin LeMasney and the LeMasney stronghold. And he said, and Ward 3 in Boston was the biggest LeMasney stronghold. He said through his arm, which they called the Hendricks Club.
And he controlled. Give us a background on Lamazny and how he worked his politics in those days.
Well, from what I've gathered, from what I've read and talked to individuals, is that Lamazny was a individual who gained his power through allowing and being able to get other people jobs and other people positions within the city government, either being elected or through being appointed.
Mm-hmm.
In times gone by, they claimed that was the Boston Tammany Hall.
Mm-hmm. We'll show a picture of that shortly after. Tell us, what was the Tammany Hall?
Well, Tammany Hall, again, was riddled with scandal in New York, but it was again, a group that controlled a great deal of the politics in New York, as Lamazny controlled Ward 3 in the West End.
So that's why they associated it with he brought it to Boston. What?
Well, he had his own little mixture, but on the same idea.
Okay. And was Curley around in those days? Or?
Oh, surely. From what I understand, Lamazny was a good friend of James Michael Curley.
And that's where he got his savvy?
A little bit of both.
Okay.
A little bit of both.
So when anybody in the West End needed a favor, they automatically went to Lamazny
and the Hendricks Club.
Okay.
You know, nowadays, it's called corruption. Howie Carr has a ball with it. But in those days, basically, they put a lot of people to work. You know, they gave people an opportunity to get a job. Whether it's right or wrong, that's the way it was done. It's still, and as Howie Carr will benefit, it's still being done today.
And in return for that job or whatever, you gave a vote to whoever you were told to. Was that what you're trying to get at?
Well, basically,
well,
also with the Hendricks Club at that time, it was predominantly an Irish association, and the Irish at that time had controlled Ward 3.
Mm-hmm. And your dad sort of broke that Hendricks Club, the Lamazny stronghold?
Well, for city council out of Ward 3, Dad was the first Italo-American elected to the city council. That was the old 22-man council.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, I think there's even a little article in there about him breaking the Hendricks Club hold of Ward 3 and the Lamazny machine.
Oh, 22 men in those days, huh?
Yeah,
wow.
There were 22, one for each ward.
Do you know when that changed?
I believe it was in the 50s with Plan E.
Boy, those council, those must have been quite colorful going to those council fights. And
again, I think there was a change back with the 15-man council that we have now in Boston to try to give your representation back to the people. I think the 22-man council is something that should still be here in some respects. Maybe the wards would have to be changed a little, but that gave the representation. I remember as, from my dad telling me and my brothers telling me and my mother telling me that City Hall was our kitchen.
mm-hmm.
When someone had a problem in the West End, they called my dad when he was there.
Mm-hmm.
And he settled it out with the city. He took their part and he took their fight to City Hall.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's hard nowadays, unless you know a city councilor. Personally, you don't have that opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
I said, you were more, I believe, the old 22-man council, you were more accountable to the people you represented.
So whether your dad knew you or not, even if you were a stranger, he'd attempt to help.
If you were in his ward, you were going to be voting in his election, he was going to make sure that he would try to help you in everywhere he can. Not only because of the vote, but just because of the fact that you're a human being
mm-hmm.
in need of help.
Yeah,
Even in those days, I can remember Dad telling me about the time that the garbage disposal went on strike. They weren't picking up any of the trash, and my dad, along with my uncle John DeMari, rented a truck and collected the trash in the West End.
Imagine that. Boy, you don't get that today.
Well,
that's quite a story.
He always said he'd clean up in politics.
Wow. We'll show a picture of your dad here. Can we get a shot of this, please? This shot right here, this picture.
That shows it as Boston, November 6, 1939. Probably, of anything else, that shows the change in in Ward 3, the change in the city at that time, and in the West End. You know, many times you talk about the fact that the West End was not a homogeneous neighborhood. We had many, many different nationalities. Here it shows the Syrian and Lebanese uniting in a poster that Dad had put to elect him as city councilor. That was on his first run. This was one he made. He said the one before that he had lost. I said, but this shows again that there are so many different nationalities that had come into prominence in the West End.
Mm-hmm. What year was that picture taken?
Well, that was the picture itself of Dad was in 1936.
Okay, and we're gonna get a shot of another picture here.
Oh, that's in Italian. He said consigliere municipale. That's city councilor.
And what was that? What's this article pertaining to? Was you say your dad was the first Italo-American
elected to Ward 3
okay.
City Council.
Okay, and this picture was taken when?
The picture itself was taken 36. This was his 1939 run.
Okay.
I said, in fact, the next article mentions Attorney J.A. Polcari, who many people know through the West End, a prominent figure in the West End in those days.
Who were some of the people your dad ran against in the West End?
Well, in this particular election in 39, the incumbent city councilor was John I. Fitzgerald. He was a member of the Hendricks Club and an incumbent city councilor at the time.
Okay. And we were discussing before the show Honey Fitz. Tell us who Honey Fitz was.
Oh, Honey Fitz, well, many know, was Rose Kennedy's father, very prominent in city politics and in West End politics in those days.
Well, what role did he play in West End politics? Do you recall studying?
Well, I believe he was a representative in the West End, and, well, my father always used to say he had a good voice because my dad used to play the banjo while he sang My Wild Irish Rose.
Oh, wow.
So even within politics, there was always time for a little frivolity.
So what we're learning today is what a lot of people don't know is the Kennedy politics started in the West End many, many years ago.
Oh, the maternal part of it did.
Sure.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
And actually Jack Kennedy was elected while his residence was in the West End on Bowdoin Street.
Sure, that was when he was first elected.
He was elected both to Congress in 1946. As it turned out, my dad would always say that Kennedy ran against him for Congress in 46.
Who won?
Jack Kennedy did. History will tell you that.
Okay.
I said, in fact, there's a little story that goes along with that. In 1956, when just after Kennedy had lost the vice presidential nomination to Estes Kefauver for national vice president, my dad was at a function, and I happened to be accompanying him because my mother had been ill, and we were waiting to be introduced. We were going to be on the head table together. And Jack Kennedy came in, and he was a senator, naturally, and my dad turned around to me and said, "You know, Jack, I'm glad you defeated me for Congress." And Kennedy looked at him and he said, "Come on, Joe, what do you mean?" He said, "No, I'm glad you defeated me for Congress because I wasn't born in this country. And not being born in this country, I can't be president." He said, "But you're going to be president someday." But I'll never forget this. He grabbed him by the collar, but he said that there's one thing that I want to tell you and anyone else, and that is the fact that a president of the United States was a candidate against this young boy's father or his children or his grandchildren for Congress. And Dad really felt, frankly, in those days that the only reason he couldn't be president was the fact that he wasn't born here. He felt that the opportunity was within this country so great that anyone could be president. Whether we can do it now, that's a different story.
See, that's quite a story. That goes to show you that the prejudice did exist in those days also.
Well, I think what it always showed me as a child and growing up was the fact that we have the greatest country here, and my dad never made it through the 9th grade, His teachers wanted him to go on, but he was the oldest in his family, and it was time to go out and do some work.
In those days, that's what you had to do.
Yeah, he did the push cart work. He slept on the push carts on a Friday night so they'd have the prime spot Saturday morning. And in fact, one of the first things he did as city councilor was to give each push cart vendor his own area down at the market so that they wouldn't have to line up and race through the streets in order to get down there.
Speaking of push carts in the market, and I guess after your dad's time, I guess the Langone family took over and were very instrumental in.
Well, Dad, you know, the Senator Langone, he was a senator at the time that Dad was elected as a city councilor.
Mm-hmm.
But the representative encompassed more than Ward 3 in those days.
Okay. And as I say, Freddie Langone took over the market. As of recent days, he had been involved in the market still.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with looking out after those who are in your precinct and in your voting area.
Great. We have to go to another picture here. We've been talking about Honey Fitz. And we got a picture here. I'm going to put my finger on it. Maybe we could get a shot of that, of Honey Fitz in those days.
It looks. I'll take it from what it says in the paper. I didn't know him at that time.
Can you point that out to it's on camera? Okay, that's Honey Fitz, right.
Having my dad and my mother, my mother and dad. My mother passed away a year and a half ago.
Okay.
And Dad about 5 years ago.
This picture was taken
in 1939.
Is that during election time? Or?
Yeah, they were casting a ballot.
Oh, great.
I have a little bit of election in me. I was born on election day. So.
Are you kidding?
No. Oh. My mother went to Precinct 7 on the old Washington School on Norman Street to vote, and then the doctor was waiting outside, and he took me they took my mother to the hospital. I happened to be close to her at the time.
Did you actually help your dad in his campaigns, or did your brother?
Well, my brothers did, more so, myself. They said, I can remember as a kid going around for others. My dad's, in 1950, he had stopped running and became a election commissioner. And he used to have a lot of people come and ask him for his support and his help. And we had the old sound wagons that would go around the streets, and I can remember going around with the sound wagons and turning and having the records and well, now they would be called taped announcements. In those days they were on celluloid, but they spoke of what the individuals wanted to do for the particular town or city where they were in.
And they don't do much of that today. I guess the people complain about noise and all that, but in those days everybody looked forward to the sound truck coming around.
The sound truck, the local street gatherings. The only time we see it now in Boston is on the day before election, basically. The old G&G down in Mattapan is gone. You don't see those anymore, and those rallies and peps. He said, but that was a great part of my memories of Boston, growing up in Boston politics. I think it was a chance for the average individual to get to meet the people on a one-to-one basis in many instances. And I know a lot of the politicians in those days loved it too.
Well, we just had an election in the city of Boston, and Dap O'Neill, old Dap, topped the ticket. And part of the reason why he topped the ticket is because he gets out there every day and mingles with the people and goes to the wakes and the funerals and the weddings, and that's what it's all about. And he learned from many, many years ago that's how it was. And
oh,
Dap
was
today.
Yeah, he's an old Roxbury boy, and he knows what it is to keep close to his friends and people. And he's a hard worker. You're right. He is a hard worker.
And it pays off.
And he's a frank speaker too.
Okay, right. And it pays off. And I guess your dad did the same thing in those days, didn't he?
Yeah, he didn't. If he had a strong feeling about something, he didn't mince words. He said what he felt.
And I recall that in those days also that after the election was over, whoever won the election, they'd have a big motorcade with flags and banners and streamers and music. And do you recall that?
Oh yes, oh yes. Again, you're looking for it. I remember the last throwback that I remember to that was in 1960, just before the presidential election day when Jack Kennedy came into Boston.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember as a kid, well, as a teenager those days, almost an adult, running behind his car with all my friends from the West End trying to say hello, and him coming through, going to Boston Garden for a rally.
Yeah, I recall you couldn't get near that station in those days. It was a tremendous crowd.
Yeah, well, we caught him in Dock Square.
Oh, did you? Did you recall the crowd at Knott Station?
Yeah.
Wow.
It was.
And in those days, too, did they have many house parties like they want to do today, or is that, do you recall?
From what I've been told, yes, he said, but, you know, whether it was the teas in those days or more so from everything that my dad had talked about was the political rallies, the open forums, where the Michelangelo School, I remember him telling me about going there and having all the candidates there to be able to give their opinion. And also having the candidates have their people when somebody else is talking, raise their signs and give the hoopla that is almost going from the national conventions. But in those days, he said, when they spoke and when they gave their feelings about what was necessary for their community, they had their supporters there to make sure that their voice was carried over.
So what we're learning is
no megaphones either.
Things
No
haven't changed in
megaphones.
the past 40 years, because we get that today. You go to some sort of a rally today, or that one rally they do have before Election Day, and each candidate has their signs up and their followers and get a chance to speak. And so in the past 40 years, we still have the same flavor.
That part of it somewhat. The other, you know, personally, and not speaking West End politics, the other part of it, the part of looking beyond an education sometimes, but looking at it, at the individual and what he can do and what he wants to do. Sometimes that's gone. Sometimes, my personal opinion, sometimes we're looking at a facade and not really getting a chance to meet the person.
Mm-hmm. Can you remember some of the other candidates your dad ran against in those days? Was George Leary? He
Oh yeah,
George Leary.
1939. George was one of the individuals that Dad defeated. He defeated him a couple of times. A great guy, a great man. I've had the opportunity since then to sit down and talk with George on many occasions about politics. It's a shame he can't be here this evening. He can give you a first-hand knowledge of what went on in those days. But again, George was another individual who felt very strongly for the West End and for the people in the West End.
We tried to get him here today, but due to bad health, we're sorry we couldn't get him. I'll bring out another name who was very prominent, George T. Lanigan. Do you recall George T. Lanigan?
Do I recall him? He said, we were just talking about him a couple of days ago with another friend of ours from the West End. Again, a great individual, and another man that would go out of his way to do anything he possibly can, especially if you're a West Ender. He said, even to this day, he's still active from what I understand, and he would go out of his way to make sure that anything he possibly could to help a West Ender would be done.
One of the only products of the West End who I think is still active, really active in politics these days is Chris Ainella. Did he come after your dad, or?
Yeah, Chris came after my dad. He was. We usually associated him more with the North End, but
he did run out of I remember he had a storefront headquarters on Chamber Street on the West End, down the basement. And I remember working in his campaign in those days. So
I don't know if I think Chris came just after the Plan E Council came in, which was in the 50s. 'Cause he's been 30 years, I think, or 28 years, which would be under the Plan E. Wouldn't be under Ward 3 in those days. It was when they went to the 9-man council at large.
When did that happen?
As I said, I used to know. I used to have it right at my fingertips. I did a couple of papers for college on it. I wasn't very supportive of the idea in those days, but I believe it was in the middle 50s.
Getting back to Lamasny and the Hendricks Club, can you give us just an idea of what the Hendricks Club, who was, were they members, or was it just a...
Yeah, it was a social club.
Okay.
You know, my dad when he first started, he started what they called an Augusta Fraternal Association, which is a group of individuals from Augusta and Sicily, almost in the same idea.
As the Irish Hendricks Club, right?
Well, yeah, somewhat.
Okay.
Somewhat, but also was a fraternal organization, was a chance to get people together. And, you know, when we talk about the Hendricks Club in Tammany Hall and whatnot, again, I want to emphasize that from what I've read and what people I've talked to, they did a tremendous amount of good for Ward 3.
For the community.
For Ward 3, making sure that things within the ward were taken care of. And it was carried on afterwards. I think my dad did a very good job in that respect, too, for the time that he was there. But, you know, as I said, they had the control.
Mm-hmm.
They had the control. The geographics changed, the body politic changed,
Mm-hmm.
and my father was able to grasp that situation and be able to put up enough of a coalition to defeat them.
Okay, very good. The West End came down in around 60, and there was really, people were trying to organize to fight the taking of the West End, but there was really no direction from the political force in it. Can you give us an idea of what happened in your estimation?
In my opinion,
Yes.
I think that the West End became, fell to the old Roman axiom of divide and conquer.
Mm-hmm.
What was done in the West End was to, number one, divide the area so that instead of taking on a complete united political front, we'd only have to take on half the people, half the politics, half the political front. We were going to say we're going to take from Staniford Street to the Charles River. So the people who were from Staniford Street to Bowdoin Square and beyond and up on the hill would say, gee, that's too bad. But they're not going to take us. They said they weren't going to take us.
Mm-hmm.
So basically my feeling is that they divided it, they kept the political powers fractionalized, enough so that they could get their first foothold in, and once the first foothold in, the other part was going to fall.
Mm-hmm.
Because then again, once the first ball hit on the Charles River Park, the area, the other side of Staniford Street was gone.
Right. Those people who thought they were going to get away with not being evicted, they fell victim too.
Definitely. And then they didn't have the other side to help them.
Exactly, because they were gone.
And half of their own had fled by that time.
And this was done mainly through divide and conquer, broken promises, political corruption. In a nutshell, I mean, all those things came into play.
Well, I listened recently to another television show on a Sunday morning, and they were talking about neighborhoods, and they were talking about trying to avoid racial strife. They were talking about homogeneous neighborhoods. I said, and all of a sudden, I'm sitting back and I'm saying to myself, you know, there was one area, one neighborhood that had all types of nationalities, had all types of religions, and you know what the city did with that? They tore it down.
That's the sad part about it. Well, we talked about old-time politics. You were very interested. Your dad played a big role in the politics of the West End, and your family did. And I hope everybody enjoyed and got a little bit of insight of the West End those days and the politics and how the people were fooled into moving out and their property being taken. I want to thank you very much for being a guest here today. We hope to see you again in the future, and see you at the next West End video newsletter.